How did we get here? Over 65 million murdered unborn children in America since 1973. Gender-confused adolescents mutilating themselves at the applause of our federal government. Pro-life sidewalk counselors being arrested. Parents who speak at school board meetings being labeled domestic terrorists by the federal government. We're all asking the same question right now, aren't we? How did we get here? What bred this culture of death that is targeting my children and my family? What happened to the Christendom that I knew and the robust family culture in America? The answer is that things happen gradually, then suddenly. The disciples of the New York Times 1619 Project and our journalistic and cultural betters would have you believe that the systemic ills that we're experiencing now in America are the result of racist colonizers from 1619 that brought the first slaves to American shores. You see, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. The culture of death that we're in today is not coincidental. It's not an accident. It was intentionally created by a set of Marxist, socialist, totalitarian revolutionaries who were engaging in a proxy war attack against Christianity and the American family here in the States. To understand where we're going and where we're at today in this culture of death, we have to understand where we've come from. We need to look at the patron saint of feminism, whose legacy is far greater and her influence on our culture of death far more wicked than any other revolutionary that spawned out of the early 1900s. She's the founder of the American Birth Control League, which you know today as Planned Parenthood. Her name is Margaret Sanger, and you've been lied to about her.
I hope a lot of people are shocked at where we are in the culture. Something insane is happening. Madness has been unleashed in our culture. How did this happen? How did this happen so suddenly? Well, the answer is it didn't happen so suddenly. It takes a long time to go from a few intellectuals believing some bad ideas to bringing those ideas into the culture more and more and more until they bear fruit. The parallels to how Germany got to where it was in the rise of the Nazis to where we are now is extremely dramatic. It's unavoidable. The excuses church leaders gave for their silence in the 30s are precisely the same excuses many church leaders are giving today. God expects his church to be the conscience of the state. He expects believers to stand against the madness. So if believers can be lulled into a sense of complacency or into a sense of fatalism, there's nothing I can do, we've abdicated that role, and that is exactly how we got where we are now.
Why is it all of a sudden our school boards are sexually charged to confuse children? And why is our culture, even our doctors, are going against parental rights and mutilating children? What in the world is going on? Satan always goes after the young, always the young, and it's the battle for the soul of not just America, this is the battle for the soul of the world. Abortion is the #1 abomination to Almighty God. I think he's made that crystal clear. Go and study the actions of the ancient deities and what they required. This is ancient stuff. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, and what we're seeing today is exactly what the Bible foretold. He warned Israel over and over again. He would forgive a lot of stuff, but he said, forbid not, never allow your child to pass through the fire as an offering to Moloch or Remphan, the pagan gods of the ancient world. Now, we know as believers that those are demons. But God says, you have covered my land in blood, you have sacrificed your sons and daughters, and for that I will hold you accountable.
The greatness of a nation is not its navy and army and economy, it's how it treats its most vulnerable. Leviticus 20 says if any Israelite or foreigner living in Israel sacrifices a child to Molech, that person should be put to death. If any member of the community closes their eyes when that man sacrifices his child to Molech, I myself, the Lord, will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from Israel.
Isaiah 5:20 tells us, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. We're in a day where evil is now being called good. Truth has been turned on its head. The left does a good job of making things that are evil sound good. Instead of saying that you're killing your baby, we say simple things like, a mom deserves the right to have choice. Choice to do what? Choice to murder.
I admire Margaret Sanger enormously. Her courage, her tenacity, her vision.
Critical work that Planned Parenthood does on behalf of America's women every day.
It's been nearly 100 years since the first health clinic of what later would become Planned Parenthood opened its doors to women in Brooklyn.
What Christians often don't understand in the culture wars and in the fight for life is that abortion is not just one issue among many. Abortion is almost the linchpin upon which the liberal establishment swings. But what happens when you pull out a linchpin? The door falls off. And so when Roe v. Wade gets overturned and that linchpin starts getting lifted off, the liberal establishment lost their minds because they're treating it like a religious sacrament.
When Mrs. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States back in 1916, birth control was a dirty word.
I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin that people can commit.
Behind me is the Planned Parenthood of Greater New York building, a building which up until mid-2020 bore the name the Margaret Sanger Center, which sat on the corner of a street called the Margaret Sanger Square. Something happened in 2020 during the mostly peaceful, somewhat fiery BLM Incorporated Antifa arson protests, where the left went after their own. You know this about revolutions, right? They always eat their own. And so the left uncovered and actually exposed what conservatives had been saying for decades, that Margaret Sanger was a racist, eugenicist, totalitarian revolutionary who hated anyone that she said had bad genes and was unfit to reproduce. So Planned Parenthood removed their founder's name from this building and from the Margaret Sanger Square. To understand Margaret Sanger, we have to understand the early cultural and political revolutionaries who influenced her. Revolutionaries who had a far more robust commitment to their philosophy and religion than most Christians have today. If they've lied to you about their patron saint, what else are they lying about? My mother was the director of a pregnancy resource center in the early 1990s in Los Angeles County, and she was directing that center while pregnant with me. So it's been a part of our sort of family heritage for a long time, and kind of became my own in high school when I saw mutilated, aborted baby photos of first trimester children at the stage of development that there's the most public support for abortion, and at the stage of development that the culture's largely told is just an insensate blob of tissue mass at that point. And at 18 years old, I was looking at hands, feet, legs, ears, eyeballs, lips of dismembered and dissected children in the first trimester. And that was a turning point for me. Planned Parenthood wants you to accept their admission that renaming a building and removing a street sign will make all their bad things go away. But we're not going to let them get away with it that easily. We're going to expose and discover who the real Margaret Sanger was and how her intentional attack and assault against the family in America explains our current culture of death and upside down world that we're living in today. And to expose and discover who this real woman was, I'm going to visit my trusted friend and advisor, Dr. George Brandt, a worldwide expert on the patron saint of feminism.
I was speaking at an educational conference in Kansas City, Missouri, and a group of pro-life friends there invited me to come to their Saturday morning sidewalk counseling and prayer time. They believed that this particular Planned Parenthood clinic disposed of all medical waste in a dumpster behind the building. So I decided to go see. And what I did find was a bundle. As I peeled back the layers of gauze, I realized that I was holding a child, looking into unseeing eyes, this beautiful child. It was an astonishing moment where every form of violence and opposition to what is right and good and true was right there before my eyes. It was such a clear indication of what was at stake that I determined that I had to write the book, Grand Illusions. That became the opening chapter, that sequence. To this day, that moment haunts my every waking moment. Although it was horrific, I would never take it back, because once and for all, I saw clearly what is at stake here. So I have plenty of emotions around this issue, but I want those emotions to be informed. I want those emotions to be shaped by what is right and good and true. There are a lot of people who get involved in the pro-life movement out of sentiment. And sentiment is good, but sentiment has to be shaped. It has to be discipled. It has to be formed. It has to be informed. Part of the reason that I've taken the historical, biblical, and scholarly approach to a lot of these issues is we have to attack this Leviathan, not just leaf and branch, but trunk and root. And the only way that we can do that is if we know our stuff. We need to study the past, not just to understand what happened then, but to understand what's happening now.
We need to understand that Planned Parenthood is one of the largest, best funded, and most profitable 501c3s in human history. They're the second largest provider of cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers.
Their fastest growing revenue stream now is trans drugs for teens.
And they are behind all of the kooky, pornographic sex ed, gender theory, and comprehensive sexuality education in America's public schools. We are now going to put the puzzle pieces together of the Leviathan, if you will.
Every radical revolution, from the French Revolution, the radical Jacobins, the revolutions of 1848, they all failed. But Margaret Sanger understood if you can change the culture, you can usher in the revolution. And she has.
So let's start putting the pieces together here to understand the culture of death in America. Where should we begin here, and how do we start tracing the revolutionaries whose hate and ideologies turned Sanger into the woman that she was?
I think a good place to start is with Thomas Malthus.
Okay.
Malthus was an English clergyman who became concerned, thinking that population grows exponentially, but natural resources grow arithmetically, which in his mind meant that there was a population bomb about to occur. And so he came up with this vision of eliminating unwanted aspects of the population.
Because eventually population growth will outstrip our ability to provide food
Exactly.
for those people.
So if we start with Thomas Malthus, we can immediately move to Charles Darwin, who read Malthus's work and began to think about the origin of species.
His book.
His book. And it's what drove his expedition on the Beagle. And there was one man who was particularly taken with the idea. It was his half-cousin, Francis Galton, who took the ideas of Darwin and then took them one step further. If we need to ensure the ascent of the good and the descent of the bad, then let's apply that to human populations. He's the father of eugenics.
So you're saying we moved awfully quickly from survival of the fittest to his cousin, Galton, let's say...
the elimination of the unfit.
Let's say might makes
right.
Yep. So we moved awfully quickly from the premise man is an animal, so it's an animal kingdom, so the strong will survive and the weak will die, to the premise the strong must kill the weak.
This then leads to a whole question about what is sex for? If it's not for reproduction, first and foremost, what is it for?
Right.
That brings us to Havelock Ellis. He becomes a sexual theorist who develops this notion that the first and most important aspect of sexuality is not human reproduction, but rather it's the exploration of what he called the innate soul.
Don't we have evidence of letters between Galton and Havelock Ellis?
Yes.
Where Ellis tells Galton that he will do his best to push forward the eugenic theory in his writings.
And he does. One of the things about Havelock Ellis was he was quite the evangelist. He believed that it was his mission not just to explore these things and to write about these things, but to begin to mentor young men and women to take this to the ends of the earth.
Wow.
It was the Great Commission flipped upside down.
That's right.
The whole purpose behind this is to overturn Western civilization.
That's right.
No gods, no masters. By this time, Marxism has been discredited as a political movement. But the notion behind Marxism of replacing the old Christendom with something fresh and new is very much alive. Now, instead of economics and politics, it's being driven by human sexuality, morality, the transformation of the family. So Havelock Ellis writes and begins to influence all of these radicals after the turn of the century. People like Emma Goldman, a famous anarchist. So Emma Goldman founds the Mother Earth magazine. And so she becomes very influential because she comes to the US and begins to mentor a whole group of Greenwich Village radicals. Because a part of the vision is, if you're going to change the culture, you've got to approach it culturally.
It was here in Greenwich Village, New York, in the early 1900s, about between 1912 and 1914, that Margaret Sanger and a group of revolutionary leftists would gather in an apartment about 2 blocks from here to host speakers, to discuss leftist revolutionary tactics, to host actual anarchists and communists and members of the Socialist Party and the New York labor movements. Margaret Sanger would gather here with her friends Emma Goldman, an open socialist and anarchist, Bill Haywood, a communist and a member of the Communist Party and the New York labor movement here in America, and actually the co-founder of the ACLU as well, Roger Baldwin. Are you starting to sense some of the cohesion and integration that was happening between the secular moral revolutionaries and how they were carefully planning the culture of death that we're now seeing unfold before us in the 21st century? So much of what is plaguing the American family, our children, and the social fabric in America today happened and started here in Greenwich Village, New York.
Margaret Sanger is radicalized. So she starts to write and create pamphlets that run afoul of the Postmaster General's anti-obscenity laws to protect the male.
What gets her indicted is some of her writing in Sanger's first magazine,
Yes,
Woman Rebel,
right.
that bore the mast, No Gods,
No masters.
and No Masters. And
And the subtitle was To Create a Race of Thoroughbreds,
wow.
which gets her arrested. So she flees to England. So there in England, she begins to formulate this plan.
Wow.
Here's how we push forward the revolution. We push it forward by freeing the libido, freeing women from the consequences of that libido by limiting birth.
Now, wait, Dr. Grant. She was advised quite clearly by Havelock Ellis to literally tone down her revolutionary sounding themes, because here's where she's in England, because she was talking too much about anarchism and communism.
Right.
Little not so popular.
Right.
And Havelock Ellis coached Sanger to focus on the more scientific sounding themes.
Yeah, one of the things that
eugenics
one
and
of the
birth
things
control.
that we see with Sanger is she is a quick learner, and she is politically astute. She measured what she would say. And by the way, she was involved in very promiscuous relationships.
So she begins an affair, actually, with Havelock Ellis. He writes in his letters about his sexual experiences in bed with Sanger, forces his wife to read them, and Havelock Ellis drives his wife insane.
Yeah. He actually, as you mentioned before, they would oftentimes have orgies in their home, and he forced his wife to watch him as he had these entanglements with others, men and women.
So once again, we moved really fastly from the premise, man is an animal, to eugenics, to sexual chaos, to child sacrifice.
When she comes back to the U.S., she decides that it is time to really and truly take action, and that's when, in 1916, she founds the first birth control clinic in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York.
After years of this ideological formation from her most radical friends from around the globe, this is where Sanger put her ideas into practice. Folks, this is where it all started. It was here at 46 Amboy Street in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York, that Sanger opened up her first unlicensed, illegal birth control clinic. Her clinic opened on October 16th, 1916, with a line of 140 immigrants stretched around the block. Now, Sanger and her sister Ethel were unable, shockingly, to find any doctors to help them out with this new revolutionary contraceptive procedure, so they illegally performed the procedure themselves. Within 9 days, the police shut down the first Planned Parenthood birth control clinic, and Sanger and her sister were sentenced to 30 days in the workhouse. They were arrested for the distribution of obscene illegal birth control methods. But this didn't stop Sanger This was just the beginning of what would turn into the Planned Parenthood as we know it today. But why start in Brownsville? Why here? Why not where Sanger lived, in Greenwich Village, with her bohemian salons and gatherings of alcohol-filled conversations about how to overtake the world with her rich white friends? No. It was over here in Brownsville that she opened up her first Planned Parenthood, because Brownsville was a poverty-stricken neighborhood largely comprised of immigrants, Blacks, Slavs, Italians, and Jews. The very specific groups of people that Sanger defined as unfit to reproduce, those that she thought were a threat to the gene pool, to the kind of perfect and perfected human race that she was seeking to create. It was here that it all started. Ideas come from people, but people come from places. And this is where the organization we know today as Planned Parenthood began. So as soon as Sanger was released from prison, serving in the workhouse for breaking New York state law, she immediately launched the publication that would guide her ideological and Planned Parenthood's ideological foundation for the next 20 years. It was called the Birth Control Review. It was a magazine, it was a publication, which she then opened up and invited her radical eugenicist friends and contacts from around the world, some of them serving in Hitler's Third Reich, to publish their articles on eugenics in her magazine, to platform these ideas on the American and on the world stage. It was here, in the poverty-stricken neighborhood of Brownsville, that Sanger coined the term birth control and set the stage for the deeply racist eugenic ideology that resulted in the billion-dollar organization today known as Planned Parenthood. So Dr. Grant, we said earlier that 100 years ago, following the science meant being a eugenicist. This had major sway in the American landscape as well.
Which leads us eventually to a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, in 1927. It was a challenge to the Virginia sterilization law, the mandatory forced sterilization law, and the Supreme Court decided overwhelmingly, 8-1, to uphold the standards of the law.
And here's the thing that was significant about Buck versus Bell is I can show you the Planned Parenthood webpage where they admit, because of BLM, Antifa, 2020, George Floyd, 1619 Project, systemic racism, that Sanger endorsed the Buck versus Bell decision. And let's be clear here, Sanger was very clear about the goals of Planned Parenthood. She once said, eugenics without birth control seems to us a house built upon the sands. It is at the mercy of the rising streams of the unfit. There's that word again.
The unfit.
Fit and unfit. We now get to 1948. If you Google the term, father of the sexual revolution, if you Google that term, the first 10 pages of Google will be a man named
Alfred
Kinsey.
Through the process of sexual abuse, child pornography, rape, the introduction of all manner of bestial and homosexual acts. He documented all of this
quite literally
to establish that there is a separation between the body and the soul, or the true identity.
So the Gnostics.
So we begin with a kind of bizarre occultic Gnosticism, which leads us eventually to the gender revolution.
The medical director of Planned Parenthood, Mary Calderon, who leaves Planned Parenthood in '64 to
establish SIECUS,
which stands for?
At the time, if you look it up today, it says something different. It says societal change, but it was designed for sexuality education.
Yep, the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, SIECUS, started by Planned Parenthood's medical director in 1964
and
with this
funded by
Hugh Hefner, the seed money provided by Hugh Hefner. Now listen, all of the righteously angry mama bears and papa bears coming to school board meetings. Have you noticed this like global or American grassroots Tea Party level movement of moms and dads speaking at school board meetings? Why? Because of this radical pornographic sex ed, which begins in '64.
and is driven by and becomes a revenue stream for her former employer, Planned Parenthood.
That's right.
So where do gay pride parades come from? Where does the Stonewall movement come from? Where does Drag Queen Story Hour come from? Where does Playboy magazine come from? Where does all of this mess come from? It's a long, long line, and it has nothing to do with education, with women's health, with any of the things that they purport to uphold. This is simply the overturning of the standards of an entire civilization.
Christians tend to want to try to, master arguments for individual issues like abortion and sex education. The trouble is that they're not effective when they're divided up like that. There's an underlying worldview under all of the secular issues that we're facing, and if we master that worldview, it becomes much easier. There is no major secular bioethicist today who denies that life begins at conception. So how do they get around that to support abortion? Well, they say the fetus is human but not a person, and then personhood becomes defined in terms of mental abilities. And we don't call it a person until it's earned the right to personhood in the sense of acquiring certain level of cognitive functioning, self-awareness, and so on. And when does that happen? Notice, for one thing, how fundamental this is. Being human is no longer enough for human rights, because they acknowledge that the fetus is human, but still don't acknowledge that it has human rights. And that's why people are calling it Gnosticism. The early church faced Gnosticism. Several books of the Bible, of the New Testament, are written against Gnosticism. And so they denigrated the body as the prison of the soul. But today, I think we see that Gnosticism most clearly in the transgender movement, because transgender activists argue explicitly that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex, nothing to do with your body. So here's the logic. If our bodies are products of blind, purposeless material forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. They give no clue to our identity. They have no moral message. We may do with them as we see fit. But what does the Bible say? The Bible says the world was created for a purpose, right? It's evident to observation that living structures are created for a purpose, that eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, wings are for flying, and fins are for swimming. In fact, the development of the entire organism is driven by an inbuilt plan or blueprint, the DNA code. And so science itself is on our side. It tells us that we were created for a purpose, that there is a plan, an order, a design, and that what Christians are saying is that if we live in harmony with that plan, we will be happier and healthier. I went to the Library of Congress and read the original sources. I read Kinsey and I read Sanger. Kinsey was very difficult to read because more than anyone I've ever read, his materialist worldview just governed even the language he used. For example, when he talked about sex, he meant only the physiological act itself. The moral dimension, the spiritual dimension, the social dimension, marriage, family, love and commitment, none of that mattered. It was just a physiological response. And because of that, it was the same no matter what context it was in. Whether it was in marriage, whether it was prostitution, whether it was two men, whether it was two women, whether it was adult and child, whether it was human and animal, the physiological response is the same. And therefore for him, they're all the same. By the way, that's where love is love comes from. Homosexual rights movement says love is love. It was Kinsey. All sexual outlets are the same. Kinsey was a big part of the movement to say children are sexual beings, and therefore they have a right to sexual expression just like anyone else. Mary Calderoni was one of the people who really popularized the phrase, all children are sexual, and therefore we need to treat them as sexual beings from the beginning. And what that meant for her, we give them very explicit sexual education. Just like Margaret Sanger, she had a religious vision, and she thought sexuality would be the means of producing the new man. That was the language they used back then, the new man. Today we might say transhumanism. So Mary Calderoni talked about using sexuality to create the new man. She too believed that if we could just liberate people from their sexual hang-ups, the sexual constraints and any sort of moral guardrails, that we would create the new man, and who would be sort of the next stage of evolution.
So she opens the first birth control clinic in the Brownsville section of New York in 1916. We could call this the first Planned Parenthood clinic.
Yes.
Something else happened interesting in 1916. A man named Madison Grant writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race. So now we have some of the ideology and individuals that lead to Sanger, and it's quite easy to trace the impact of these people and individuals on her life. But Madison Grant would later share office spaces with his organization, the American Eugenics Society, with the American Birth Control League when it's founded in 1921.
He was another one of the acolytes of Havelock Ellis. He was involved in all manner of radical politics prior to the establishing of the American Eugenics Society. Some of the most articulate advocates of eugenics were highly placed. In fact, one of the most horrific of all of the eugenics screeds was written by Lothrop Stoddard. Came and did his PhD at Harvard and took his dissertation, boiled it down for the masses, and created the book
The Rising Tide of Color
Against White World Supremacy. Even more shocking, Stoddard was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and was identified as the exalted cyclops of the Massachusetts KKK, where his books were recommended reading.
And is he not a founding board member of the American Birth Control League?
Yes.
Launched in 1921, later to be renamed
Planned Parenthood. Yes.
Wow.
This is the same year, by the way, 1920, that two German Jewish scholars, Karl Binding and Alfred Hoch, write a book entitled
German Jews.
German Jews. They write a book titled Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, Its Measure and Form.
Wow.
It was a moral justification for the slaughter of the undesirable masses.
Lebensinwertensleben. Now, the Nazi Party's chief racial theorist, Alfred Rosenberg, appropriates the German term Untermensch from the English version of Lothrop Stoddard's other book, The Menace of the Underman. Underman, Untermensch, the title of Heinrich Himmler's famous Nazi propaganda book, who he would meet with in 1939 when he travels to Germany. Am I right that the Nazis got the term subhuman from the English version of Planned Parenthood's founding board member's book?
That and the book by Binding and Hoch, who were Germans, and in communication with Lothrop Stoddard, influencing all of these guys.
Now, lest you think we're jesting, folks, okay? In 1934, a German race anthropologist named Hans F. Gunther listen to this, refers to Lothrop Stoddard, the Massachusetts KKK leader, and he refers to Madison Grant, who Hitler called his book his Bible. This German race anthropologist calls Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant the what?
The spiritual fathers of Nazi Germany.
Wow. Who is Leon Whitney you put here?
Leon Whitney believed that it was important for the government to step in and mandate selective sterilization as a birth control measure enforced on the human weeds, those undesirable peoples.
I think Leon Whitney and Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant would begin writing for Sanger in her magazine that would guide her ideological foundation for the next 3 decades, the Birth Control Review.
And they were speakers at her first big eugenics conference in New York City.
The book, written in 1916, The Passing of the Great Race, the same year the first Planned Parenthood clinic is opened, that book Hitler refers to as his Bible?
His Bible. And interestingly, Lothrop Stoddard's book, you'll remember he goes and he travels to Germany and interviews Himmler and Hitler. Himmler said that Lothrop Stoddard's 2 books, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy and The Revolt Against Civilization and the Menace of the Underman. These, for Himmler, become the blueprint for the creation of the final solution.
So now, with all of these influences, with Sanger's first book, with the launching of Planned Parenthood in 1921, she then begins to transform these international relationships, not just through literature, but literally gathering some of these individuals to come from around the world at a what's this? Neo-Malthusian birth control conference.
Yeah.
Surely she didn't call it that. Surely she wasn't that overt.
No,
calling her conference a Neo-Malthusian. Thomas Malthus, there's too many people on planet Earth, so therefore we have to decide who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets sterilized, who gets to have kids and who doesn't. Are you telling me that 4 years after Planned Parenthood's founded, she calls her own conferences at the Hotel McAlpin in New York City a Neo-Malthusian conference?
She does indeed. Sanger had already been attending eugenics conferences, including the Second International Eugenics Congress in 1921, hosted by the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations, an organization led by her friend, advisor, guest writer for her magazine, the man who designed Hitler's euthanasia program, which eliminated a whole host of what they called defectives, people with disabilities, gypsies, and eventually, of course, morphs into the final solution.
This Ernst Rudin or Eugen Fischer?
Ernst Rudin.
Ernst Rudin, who was a personal advisor and friend of the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. Ernst Rudin, who took an early role in organizing the Nazi Society for Racial Hygiene?
That's right.
Margaret Sanger did not let her arrest slow her down. On the contrary, she only sped up the revolutionary agenda that she birthed in her mind in this city over 100 years ago. And in 1925, Margaret Sanger and her friends at the American Birth Control League hosted their 1925 Neo-Malthusian Birth Control Conference at this building right behind me, previously called the Hotel McAlpin. For 6 days, delegates and guests of Margaret Sanger met at the Hotel McAlpin for this conference where they cast political vision, they delivered essays, they wrote papers on how to bring the eugenics ideology onto the world stage to usher in this Sanger Planned Parenthood revolution. However, in the 1920s, those ideas were pretty unpopular in America. But in the wake of World War I, these progressive ideas were taking hold amongst nations looking to reclaim their place on the world stage, most notably by Adolf Hitler. But it was the American Birth Control League, before it was renamed Planned Parenthood, where Sanger developed her eugenic ideology and philosophy. So how is she going to take this birth control eugenics agenda to the streets of New York City? How is she going to usher in this revolution in the most culturally formative city in the world? Her next big project? An application of all of her Darwinianist ideas, the Negro Project.
So during the summer of 2020, tensions were high. Found myself at Drake Circle, a woman's choice clinic of Raleigh, on a Saturday morning. And I'm out there praying and worshiping, and a father walks up to me wearing a BLM shirt, and he says to me, "Why are you out here fighting a white man's issue?" Now, I was taken aback when he said that, because the majority of the people out there praying, trying to save the babies, are white. But the majority of the moms in the clinic prepared to abort their baby, they're black, including this gentleman's girlfriend. But he could only see a racial issue in that I was over there with the white people trying to worship and pray and save babies. And what I took away from that conversation was that this gentleman probably didn't know what critical race theory meant, but he was a walking poster child for all things CRT, because in critical race theory, you see racism in all things and at all times. Even when a 6'4", 260-pound black man is trying to save a baby, Margaret Sanger had a wicked agenda, and she knew what her aim was. It was to rid this country of blacks and to get rid of those who were defected and those who had disabilities. She develops a plan on how she should go about doing it. She does say that she wants to exterminate the black population, but she desired to keep it cloaked. So she was strategic in finding men like W.E.B. Du Bois, trying to get support from Dr. King, and many other prominent black leaders in New York, where she had her flagship clinic. And what has happened, many black preachers today don't speak out against what Margaret Sanger tried to do, but many have become parrots of the Planned Parenthood industry, and they support her initiative and her causes by not even addressing it to their congregation.
We talk a lot about the destructive nature of Planned Parenthood's ideas and revolution and how it's been ravaging the black community in America. But I wanted to come to Raleigh, not just to learn from John the devastation of the last 100 years, but also to get a glimpse of a community that has been boldly standing for the unborn, for marriage, for family, and for truth, and really defying Sanger's playbook and vision for what she called the morons and the misfits, the unfit to reproduce. For years, week in and week out, John and members of his church have been showing up outside of abortion centers in Raleigh, not just to protest against these ideas, but to pray against the evil that has been quite literally ripping the black community apart in America.
So this is the Woman's Choice Clinic of Raleigh, but don't be fooled by that name. There's only one choice that they care about. This clinic sees several thousands of customers every month, but 70% of their clientele are black customers. And we have an organization called the Happy Warriors. They come out here every Saturday to stand for life. They're on the corner here. Hundreds and hundreds of babies are now alive because of the Happy Warriors. We've thrown countless baby showers. Many of the moms go on to give their life to Christ. So that's a 2-for-1. Save the baby and she's won to the kingdom.
Yeah.
God, you told us to occupy until you come. God, we don't know when you're coming, but we believe that it's soon. It's sooner than soon. It's quicker than quick. God, we pray today that we look towards heaven. We don't want to look towards government, but we want to look towards heaven. You are the Supreme Court. You are the supreme power. You are the only potentate. We give you glory. We give you honor today. We bless the holy name of Jesus, and we shout, let the baby live. Let the baby live. Let the baby live. Hallelujah.
So, Pastor John, I'm coming to your church tomorrow.
Right.
The stereotype, unfortunately, in our culture is that all black charismatic churches tend to be kind of religious tools of the Democrat Party.
Sure.
They prop up the same policies and talking points, but they throw in a little Christianese.
That's right.
Tell me what I should be prepared for tomorrow morning at Upper Room Church of God in Christ in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Well, Seth, me and you have preached on many of the same platforms. We've had dialogues and conversations many times. We've had lunch in California. We've been around the country together. You've heard from me. You've seen my clips. But you've never met my mentor. I'm talking about Bishop Patrick Lane Wooden Sr., who also happens to be my father-in-law.
Wow.
He positioned Upper Room as a cause-driven church. We are the hands and the feet of Jesus. Sunday morning is our Super Bowl. You'll see that take place. But during the week, we engage the culture in the marketplace.
How would Margaret Sanger describe Upper Room Church of God in Christ?
It's a church full of rebellious Negroes who are not afraid to stand for truth, to fight for life of all colors and shades, but especially the Black community. You are in for a special treat.
Amen. We'll see you there tomorrow morning.
You got it.
We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. Hillary Clinton did say, I admire Margaret Sanger. Enormously, not a little bit, enormously. That's right. No politician would get my vote nor my support if they would have said, I admire Margaret Sanger. The woman who said, our goal is the extermination of the Negro race. What kind of Negro would vote for a woman who would say such a thing? Got to be a dumb Negro to do that. Something wrong with you, Negro. The role of the Black minister is supposed to be the role of any preacher, and that is to preach God's truth with power and authority without compromise. In my opinion, what we're seeing is too many ministers being influenced by political parties. And many preachers today are more Democrat than they are gospel preacher when it comes to things like preaching against abortion, the slaughter of the unborn. Nothing is more racist in America than the abortion industry. I think that the number one voice against abortion should be the Black preacher, and let me tell you why. Not because it's more wrong for Black people than it is for whites or others, but because we're targeted. African Americans make up 13% of the nation's population. Our Black women make up 8%, but our ovulating women make up about 3 to 4%. 3 to 4% of the population of America is responsible for almost 40% of the nation's abortions. But there's nothing more rewarding than seeing a mother come out of that clinic. I don't know her. I never met her. I may never see her again. But she gave a thumbs up. She kept her baby. Now, there are many others that we keep up with. They send us pictures. And man, we see toddlers now. They don't even know that they were marked for death. There are human beings who are alive because we live and we submit to Jesus Christ in this area. Many we will meet in glory. Can you imagine being in glory and someone walks up to you and say, you know, you don't know me. And the last time you saw me, you didn't see me because I was in my mother's womb. But your efforts helped me live. Now, if
If that's not ministry, then what is?
As Dr. George Grant says, the entire operation of the Negro Project was a ruse. It was a manipulative attempt to get blacks to cooperate in their own elimination. And tragically, that operation was largely successful. Its genocidal intentions were carefully camouflaged beneath several layers of condescending social service rhetoric and organizational expertise. Sanger's plan for the black ministers of America were to be used as tools in her deadly ideology of humanism and her revolution of eugenics. Darwin was right. Survival of the fittest. The strong will survive while the weak will die. And if Christians and preachers can't stand up against what is fundamentally false religion, then who will? This revolution and culture of death transcended American borders and boundaries, and eugenics was responsible for the slaughter of tens of millions of innocent human beings in the 20th century alone. Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Margaret Sanger would shed more innocent blood in the 20th century alone than all the murderers, tyrants, and warlords of human history before the year 1900 combined. This is what we mean by the culture of death. In New York City, we visited the historical locations of Sanger's early years as a burgeoning radical, operating under the guise of a roaring 20s misguided humanitarian. In Nashville, we connected the dots, literally, on how this birth control league was actually the product of the secular humanistic revolution of the late 1800s and early 1900s, creating a deadly ideological Frankenstein of eugenic beliefs that helped pivot American culture. In Raleigh, we saw how Sanger's Darwinist and Malthusian worldview came to its logical conclusion: abject racism against American blacks. And now I've come to Munich, Germany, to see firsthand what happens when evil goes unchecked. Over 100 years ago, on November 9th, 1923, Adolf Hitler gave his famous speech and attempted coup here in Munich on these steps between these two lions. He was arrested, spent months in jail, and it was in those deliberative months in jail that he began to build what would become the Third Reich. He begins to build his eugenic vision and his philosophy of the fit and the unfit. While in prison, he's not just twiddling his thumbs, he's actually poring over the writings of people like Lothrop Stoddard, who was a founding board member for Planned Parenthood, whose book, The Menace of the Underman, is where the Nazis got the term Untermensch, or subhuman. He begins to pore over the writings of eugenicists in America, many of whom sat on Margaret Sanger's board, were financiers of Planned Parenthood, who so looked up to what would eventually happen here with the slaughter of the unfit in Germany, that one such thinker who wrote for Sanger, a certain Leon Whitney of the American Eugenics Society, was saying the quiet part out loud and said, while we Americans were pussyfooting around, the Germans were calling a spade a spade. That's where the intellectual journey of what would become Nazi Germany began, was Hitler, after his failed coup attempt here, in prison, poring over the writings of Margaret Sanger's best friends. Listen, Sanger may have had more of a scalpel approach to eugenics, while Hitler had more of a sledgehammer approach to eugenics. But make no mistake, both were operating off of the same belief, that the unfit or the undesirables do not have the right to live. Today, Hitler and Nazi Germany are rightly universally hated and condemned for their genocide against the Jews and other minorities in the 1930s and 40s. However, Sanger and Planned Parenthood have been responsible for the genocide of tens of millions of the most vulnerable and marginalized people group in the world, unborn children. 2 genocides, both the result of the same bad ideas and the same movement that has resulted in such deadly consequences and countless victims. But one of these genocides continues today, while the other one ended, because good people did the right thing. We've come to Germany to learn what happens when evil goes to its logical conclusion. But we're also here to learn a story of hope. I'm here at Dachau concentration camp memorial just outside of Munich. Dachau was one of the first concentration camps established by Nazi Germany. Set up on March 22nd, 1933, just after Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. In its 12 years of operation, over 200,000 persons were imprisoned here, and over 41,500 were murdered here at Dachau. It's a fitting place to remember what happens when bad ideas are taken to their logical conclusion. You see, evil has no limiting principles. If evil declares someone to be unfit or undesirable, then who's to say who should live and who should die? Adolf Hitler was recorded as having told a fellow Nazi the following. He said, "Now that we know the laws of heredity, it is possible to a large extent to prevent unhealthy and severely handicapped beings from coming into the world." And then he said, "I have studied with interest the laws of several American states concerning the prevention of reproduction of people whose progeny would, in all likelihood, be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock." End quote. In other words, Adolf Hitler openly acknowledged that he was poring over and reading the writings of American eugenicists and leaders of the eugenics movement in America that included Margaret Sanger, Lothrop Stoddard, Madison Grant, Leon Whitney, and so many others who actually were jealous of how far the Nazis took their bad ideas to their logical conclusion, for not having the courage to implement similar destruction and chaos in America. Thankfully, evil did not go wholly unchecked inside Nazi Germany. Today, many people are aware of the brave stories of Corrie ten Boom's hiding of Jews and Oskar Schindler's saving of Jews, and the bold yet pastoral leadership of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was hung naked at Flossenburg prison for his resistance against the Third Reich. But today I want to tell you the story of a group of heroes well known within Germany today, yet less in the American church, but whose story is equally inspiring because they didn't blame the doers of evil. They were trying to wake up people who knew better. It's the story of a small collective of Christian students who took a stand and did what was right. And they called themselves the White Rose Resistance. Sophie Scholl was a 21-year-old young Christian student living in Munich in 1942, and she was publicly horrified at the evil and atrocities being done. Her father actually spent some time in prison for publicly criticizing Hitler, so she came from a good family of Christian resistance. And one day she was walking the sidewalks in Munich, Germany in 1942, and she found a leaflet paper on the ground. She picked it up, and it said "Leaflets of the White Rose." She begins to read this leaflet and her heart is stirred to action. It's publicly blasting and criticizing the crimes of Hitler, the evil of eugenics, and the Third Reich. They said things in their leaflets like, "We are the White Rose Resistance, we are your bad conscience, and we will not leave you alone." They said, "If you know Why do you not act? Well, these words sounded very familiar to Sophie because she thought, this sounds a lot like my brother Hans. He talks like this at dinner all the time. Come to find out, the White Rose Resistance had not only been co-founded, it was being run by none other than her older brother, Hans, a 24-year-old Christian student who was just trying to protect his little sister. He knew how dangerous political resistance to the Third Reich was in 1942. However, Sophie demanded to join this White Rose Resistance, and she became the youngest member and the only female of the White Rose Resistance. They spent the rest of 1942 and early parts of 1943 writing, distributing, and printing out illegal anti-Nazi leaflets that they then spread all across Germany to expose the deeds of darkness and wake good people up to what was happening so they would take action. Hans and Sophie didn't even believe that this was a brave or exceptional act. They just believed it was Christianity lived out. Or as Sophie put it, we are Christian and we are German. Therefore, we are responsible for Germany. On February 18th, 1943, Hans and Sophie, brother and sister of the White Rose Resistance, paced these halls at the University of Munich, distributing their anti-Nazi illegal leaflets during class time when the halls were quiet. And then in this iconic, brave scene of resistance, Sophie walked to the third floor balcony of this university and threw hundreds of leaflets 3 floors down to this atrium below. This resulted in their immediate arrest by the Gestapo, and they were sentenced to death by guillotine. Because they were arrested on February 18th, 1943, they missed a meeting they had already scheduled next week to grow Christian resistance. And that meeting was with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, founder of the Confessing Church, hung naked for his plot involving trying to assassinate Hitler. Their prison captors were so disturbed by Sophie's courage and calm in the face of death that they relaxed the rules at great threat to their own careers to allow Hans and Sophie to meet with their parents, to say goodbye in a side room right before they were taken to the chopping block. And Sophie's mother looked her doomed daughter in the eyes and said, "Remember Jesus, Sophie." And Sophie responded, "Yes, but you too, Mama, you too." Before her death on February 22nd, 1943, Sophie would tell her cellmate some of her final words. She said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there's hardly anyone willing to give themselves up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go now. But what does my death matter if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" According to the executioner, Sophie's final words with her head on the chopping block was, "The sun still shines." Here in a cemetery next to Stadelheim prison is where Hans and Sophie are laid to rest. Today they are national heroes in Germany, heralded as righteous, young, passionate individuals who were just doing the right thing, regardless of the outcome. Sophie believed that their actions, their leaflet campaign, their movement of resistance would spark a student revolt at the university and mobilize people to stand up against these evils. She knew they knew the institutional power of the church and Christians to bring a grinding halt to evil. But nothing changed. The academic institutions remained asleep. There was no student revolt. And the church continued to remain apathetic and asleep at the wheel. And Hitler's Holocaust continued for another 2.5 years. But what matters is that Hans and Sophie did the right thing regardless of the outcome. They stood up for what they believed in, even if they were standing alone, because that's what Christians have always done and will always do.
Thankfully, God never leaves us without the remnant. He never leaves us without those heroes. We love looking back at the Hans and the Sophies, at the Bonhoeffers. The truth is that we look back in order to be inspired for now and for the future.
You get to be part of something really beautiful, because imagine if the church had been turned around in Germany and we had averted the nightmare of the death camps. And I do believe right now we're on that knife edge, that our best days might be ahead of us.
The Bible teaches that your body is part of your authentic self and carries the dignity and value of the whole person. Love your body.
We don't obey government blindly, but we obey government with our Bible open and our heads and our hearts aware of what God has told us through His Word.
In law, silence equals consent. And I think in a way, God is pushing us to the point where people are given a choice to speak up or not.
Preachers, the church, needs to be the church and spread the gospel and apply the word of God to these issues. And even though she aborted that baby, Christ still died for her. And there's forgiveness for her. Only the gospel can do this.
The church is to stand in sanctified resistance against the powers that be. If I lose every battle, I'm going to keep fighting, because the end has not yet come. The end will be when I stand before Jesus Christ, and I may lose every battle on earth, but I'm going to get an A for trying, because I stood for what was biblically accurate. I could look at God in the face and say, I stood, I spoke up, and I did. In 2 Corinthians 10, verse 6, the Bible says, by us resisting or by us combating disobedience, that is when our obedience is fulfilled. There's nothing out there like White Rose resistance, because there's nothing or no one out there like Seth Gruen.
You know, the Bible talks about the sons of Issachar. And all that we know about the sons of Issachar is that they were men who understood the times they lived in. And so they knew what Israel ought to do. How simple. With an understanding of the times you live in comes a responsibility and duty to act in accordance with what you know, to push back against evil, to stand for righteousness. Sophie's passion and resolve and legacy has inspired me to fulfill her vision, to prick the collective conscience of our culture and awaken the church to action before it's too late. Sophie's life and legacy and story has so impacted mine and my family's life that we named our third child after her, Sophie Sunshine. I am rebuilding the White Rose resistance for this generation against our silent but far more deadly Holocaust of abortion, to build the army of Christian resistance that Hans and Sophie dreamed of, but never saw realized. While all of the members of the White Rose resistance were found and executed, their sacrifice has planted the good seeds of resistance in the hearts of millions whose actions will keep alive the legacy of the White Rose. And your sacrifice, church, this late hour of our culture, will water those seeds of resistance. So one day, maybe, thousands will be awakened and stirred to action. It's time to wake up, guys. Every human being is a person, and every person has the right to be born. Together we can see the White Rose blossom again. For as Sophie said in her final words, the sun still shines. The most common response I get when I share this message is, Seth, I never knew. But now you do know. Your eyes have been opened to a sinister, evil, wicked master plan spanning decades, and yet there are still millions of Christians in America who remain in the dark. Good people who simply don't know how we got here. We are the fastest growing pro-life organization in America, and at the White Rose Resistance, we need your help to empower, educate, and inspire the millions of people who are with us to take action in rebuilding this resistance to stem the tide and rebuild a culture of life before it is too late. We invite you to join us and become an ally of the White Rose Resistance to distribute this message of the 1916 Project far and wide to prick the conscience of our culture and awaken the church to action. Go to thewhiterose.life and join us in rebuilding Christian resistance in America. If not you, who? If not now, when?